What we're seeing there is not actually a picture of the web itself. That's a picture of the movements of a spider that were recorded on a particular day. That's a particular spider on a particular day. Its movements were all fed into the computer, and now the computer is playing it back to us. But that's just a recording of the web of a real particular spider. Now, in order to do our trick of making an arthropomorph-like program out of spider webs, we've got to make the computer behave like a spider. And this is the program written by Peter Fuchs, I'm glad to say is next door, controlling the computer. And what his program does is to make the computer build a web as if it was a spider. So the computer is holding in its little head the rules that we know something about of how a spider builds a web. So the computer does the radii like that. It does the spiral like that. Now, just as in the case of the arthropomorphs, what Peter has done is to make the building rules of the computer spider under genetic control. There are genes in the computer just as there were for the arthropomorphs, and just as there were for the arthropomorphs, the genes are simply numbers. That is the parent web. These are the daughter webs. More strictly, that's the web that was built by the parent spider. These are the webs that were built by the daughter spiders. Now, to begin with, we can treat this just as if it was an arthropomorph program. So we want another volunteer. Let's have a girl this time. Right. Yes, please. What's your name?
Ursula.
Ursula. Come here, Ursula, please. Have you ever used a computer with a mouse?
Yes.
Yes, good. So this time it's just like the other one, only you have to click twice instead of once to choose which one you think is the best web. Okay, now that web is gone up to the top there. That's now become the parent. And here are the daughter webs that are being drawn. And now you can choose another one, another generation. So you see, we're doing just the same as we did for the arthropomorphs, but now we've got spider webs coming. But the point we were going to go for was not artificial selection. The whole point of doing this with spider webs is to do something like natural selection. And to do that, we simply make the computer work out how good each web would be at catching flies. And we can do that because, unlike the case of the arthropomorphs, the webs are two-dimensional structures, and we know what they're for. They're for catching flies. So the benefit is simply going to be the number of flies caught, and the cost we can calculate because the cost is the amount of silk used. Spider webs are made of silk. So the cost of a web is the amount of silk used, and the benefit is the flies. Now, if you'd like to stop now, Ursula, thank you very much. Yeah. Now, we no longer have a human selector, we now have the flies doing the selecting. So the flies are going to hit the web when Peter gets it started up again. And right, so now we've got a new generation of webs being built, and we're now going to see the flies hitting the webs. There come the flies again. Now the computer is going to calculate which of the webs is best at catching flies, and it's that one that's gone dark. So that one will now become the parent of the next generation. And now, once again, the webs are being built, the child webs are being built. Once again, the flies will come. The computer will measure which one of them is the best. There it is, and that becomes the parent of the next generation. Now, it wouldn't take very long for us to see the evolution starting from no web at all and going to a nice web that works very well. But we haven't quite got time for it, so instead what we did was to let the computer run all night, all last night, and we've got a fossil record of all the webs that were built during that time. This was the starting web, the thing that started at the beginning of the night's run, and then every 20 generations we have a printout of the shape of the web. So we see we start with almost no spiral at all, and you could imagine the flies just whizzing straight through and not getting caught. But then natural selection in the computer led to a gradual improvement in the web, more and more spiral, more and more flies caught, and so evolution went in the direction of a nice full web with a nice full spiral like that, catching lots of flies. That all went on in the computer last night, very fast, telescoping into one night what would have taken thousands of years, perhaps millions of years, in nature. In nature, the successful and the unsuccessful webs would not, of course, be judged by the computer doing a calculation about how many flies would have been caught, would be expected to be caught. They'd be judged automatically, the webs would be judged automatically and without any thought by the flies themselves. The flies themselves just fly into webs, thereby choosing webs for breeding. The flies don't know they're choosing the webs for breeding. They don't particularly want to fly into the webs. But nevertheless, the consequence of their inadvertently flying into webs is that the spider that built the successful web is a spider that's more likely to breed, and therefore more likely to pass on the genes for building that sort of web. So as the generations go by, webs get better and better and better, just as they did in the computer in our overnight run. That's natural selection in the case of spider webs, and exactly the same principle works for every living creature, for the bodies of every living creature. Every lion and tiger, every camel, every dog, every human, every giraffe. They all have evolved by the same process of evolution by natural selection. So the Darwinian view is that designoid objects are not designed at all. They have evolved by natural selection. The most popular alternative to the Darwinian view is called creationism. Creationists believe that designoid objects are really designed objects. The only difference is that whereas these designed objects were designed by humans, these designed objects were designed by a divine creator. And the favourite argument of creationists is the so-called argument from design, which was most famously expressed by Archdeacon William Paley in 1802 in the book Natural Theology. And Paley begins his book, "In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever." In other words, the stone is the kind of object which had always been there and doesn't need any special kind of explanation. But, Paley goes on, what if I accidentally kicked a watch? The watch, I open it up, I see the mechanism, I see the cogwheels and the springs, everything about it looks designed. It had to have a designer. It had to have a watchmaker. And if the watch had to have a watchmaker, then how much more, Paley argued, must these objects, these living objects, including ourselves, have had a divine watchmaker? For Paley, it follows as clearly as the night follows the day, that just as the watch had to have a designer, so do we have to have a designer. But of course, just to show that animals and plants look as though they've got a designer begs the question. I spent much of this lecture trying to persuade you that animals and plants look as though they've got a designer. But I spent the other half of the lecture showing you that there's another very good alternative explanation for why they look as though they had a designer, namely natural selection. Well, Paley, of course, lived before Darwin, so he couldn't be expected to know about the alternative. Nevertheless, it was, even without knowing about Darwin, it was possible back in the 18th century to know that Paley's argument was a pretty bad argument. And this was pointed out by David Hume, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Hume made the point that the argument from design, which was Paley's argument, is that things like elephants and humans are too complicated to have come about by chance. They have many parts, just like a watch. Too complicated to have come about by chance. A designer, a watchmaker, an engineer, is certainly one way in which these objects could come about. These objects could come about. But a watchmaker, or a designer, or an engineer, if he's to be any good as a watchmaker or an engineer, must be a pretty complicated object himself.